Hello and welcome to Hyperpolyglotting with Elise. Now, I've spoken quite a lot on this channel about comprehensible input and how important it is for language acquisition. I've shown you one example of one of my favorite sources of comprehensible input, translated editions of John Grisham's The Firm, and today, by which I mean whenever you're watching this, I'd like to show you another great source of comprehensible input in a large variety of languages. It's free, and there is a lot of it. I'm talking about how-to videos. Whether you're interested in learning how to make a chorrillana in Spanish or hachapuri in Georgian, play the English opening.
24. Так начинается английское начало. Дебют был придуман известным английским шахматистом.
Components on a PC motherboard.
Kann sein, dass ihr das mal hier und da ein bisschen anwinkeln müsst. In unserem Falle haben wir mehr als genug Platz, weil es halt nur...
Perméabilisation et blocage. Après la réhydratation des tissus, on perméabilise les membranes plasmiques en appliquant sur les coupes une solution de PBS
슬쩍 대체해야 됩니다. 그래야 닭고기 의 비린내, 누린내를 없앨 수
Do an
있습니다.
endotracheal intubation.
Qualora si incontrasse qualche difficoltà alla cieca, non si fa altro che prendere il laringoscopio, eseguire la laringoscopia, visualizzare
cargar el OBS y para poder mandar todo, digamos, al servidor para poder hacer ese streaming. Así que mi consejo es que pongáis siempre
通信データを解析することができます。今回なんでワイヤーシャークをお勧めしている
Or
かという
any number of other
と、ネ
things
ッ
in
トワー
any
クの
number
勉
of
強しようと
languages.
すると、
YouTube's got you covered.
物理層が何ですよ。
Now, I mean, that's the thing about YouTube, isn't it? It's very much what you make of it. It is an amazing source of crap if you don't know where to look. But on the other hand, if you do, there's all sorts of just incredible educational material on all sorts of subjects just right there waiting for you for free, and it's in all kinds of languages. Probably it's in one of your target languages. See, this sort of thing is a great source of comprehensible input for language learners, because a good how-to video will both explain clearly how to do a thing and give you a good view of the thing that's being done as it's being done. That's just ideal. That gives your brain's language acquisition device, as researchers call it, excellent points of reference in order to begin to parse the input and gradually make sense of it. In this video, I'm going to focus on how to use how-to videos, a bit meta, that, in the early and intermediate stages of language learning, because the specific nature of the input tends to matter less and less as the ratio of familiar words and phrases and expressions to new and unknown words and expressions and phrases gradually shifts in favor of the former. The more you understand the language, the more you can turn that language to any content you find in the language, in other words. In those early and intermediate stages, though, you're more likely to find a few chunks of familiar input that you actually have some shot at understanding in a just huge flow of things that you're not going to be able to make any sense of. That's why it really matters what kind of input you use. Specifically, it helps to use how-to content on more concrete topics, where somebody is demonstrating how to do an actual physical thing that you can actually observe. Cookery videos are a personal favorite of mine. This maximizes the degree to which your prior knowledge, say what dough is, or what component gets mounted on top of your CPU, can be brought to bear on the task of deciphering all this novel input. Now, when selecting a how-to video for language learning purposes, there are two basic approaches that I can think of at the moment anyway. One is using videos that explain something you already know how to do. The other is using videos that explain something you'd really like to learn to do. To my knowledge, there's no reason to believe that one of these two approaches will be objectively better than the other. So just go with whichever appeals most to you. Essentially, the first one, where you're watching a video on something you already know how to do, allows your brain to approach the task of parsing what the people are saying with maximum prior knowledge. That can be quite advantageous. The second, on the other hand, makes use of your genuine interest in learning to do whatever the video is meant to teach you. That means that the video is showing you something that you have a real interest in understanding, quite apart from language learning. The more your learning materials can hold your interest, the more you're likely to get out of them. Now, in the remainder of this video, I'm going to show you an example of a series of how-to videos that I'm currently using in order to learn Georgian. This is Gurmania, a cookery show from Georgian State TV. Georgian, I should note, is a language I currently have very little knowledge of. I have some fairly basic vocab, some understanding of how the grammar works. Spoiler alert, the verbs are quite complicated. And I know the alphabet. That's basically it for now. This show hits sort of a sweet spot that combines the two approaches I just got done explaining. On the one hand, I'm already a very accomplished cook. So I know lots of techniques, I have a good general understanding of the overall process of turning ingredients into a thing you'd actually eat. And on the other hand, all I really know about Georgian food is that they do a great line in wine and bread. They invented wine, as it happens, at least as far as archaeologists can tell. And all the Georgian food I've had has been delicious. I'd really like to learn how to cook it. As such, both the familiarity factor and the interest factor are quite strong. Gurmania has two presenters. One, Tamta Kapileshvili, hangs out in the studio kitchen where she prepares one or two dishes and explains the process direct to camera. The other, Bakhotevzadyani, goes off to the mountains or the seaside, or in one case to neighboring Azerbaijan, where he talks to locals about traditional recipes and prepares them in a rustic setting. One key aspect of how I use this program is that I set my expectations quite low. My knowledge of Georgian is just barely this side of non-existent. So if I were to expect to understand even a significant part of what's being said, disappointment and frustration would be just guaranteed. That's not going to happen. And I need to be clear about that from the start. And if you're going to use this method, you have to actually also be very clear on that this is a slow thing. As such, my goal here is to get used to the rhythms of Georgian speech, recognize words even if I don't understand them, and generally just sort of train my ears. Any words I actually recognize or understand are a bonus. This is, as I just said, a slow process, unless your target language is closely related to a language you already know, which, in my case, Georgian isn't. This is another reason why it's important to use enjoyable, interesting content. You're going to be spending a lot of time with it. Nonetheless, some words do jump out immediately. I did not need any assistance working out terms like caramelizatia, aromatizirevuli, basiliki, or pomidori, all of which are loan words for caramelization, aromatized basil and tomato. On top of that, the more you watch this sort of thing, patterns do start to emerge. At one point, for example, I noticed that every time Tamta Kapileshvili was pouring what I was pretty sure was flour into a mixing bowl, she would utter the word kwili. The on-screen ingredient list later confirmed that I had heard correctly. A quick search confirmed my suspicion that kwili was indeed flour. A slight uptick in the known-unknown ratio, the more words you definitely know, the more information you have about the ones you don't. Fundamentally, language acquisition is a kind of code breaking. Except that no one is actively trying to make the process harder for you, even though sometimes English, it can feel that way. You have knowns, you have unknowns, and you have contextual information, and your brain's mission is to work out the relationships between those things in order to make the unknowns known. So we know Quili is flower. What else does she say? We hear Tamta refer to Marili, Sapwadi, and Ali, and she adds what looks like water, yeast, and could be salt or sugar to the bowl of Quili. But then she says something about shakari, which sounds like an obvious loan word for sugar. And thus we've worked out that water is ali, salt is marili, and yeast is sapwadi. Soon after, as she handles the dough, we keep hearing her say "tsomi" over and over again, over multiple baking-related episodes. It should be clear that I didn't get any of this other than the obvious loan words on the first count. It's all a matter of hearing these things over and over again until words just start jumping out at me. After hearing both Tamta and Vafu time and again whilst handling dough say "tsomi," a light just went on. Was "tsomi" perhaps dough? It was. At this point, it's worth noting that we're talking about a relatively small number of high-frequency words, referring to very concrete things that we can see on screen. The overwhelming majority of what they're saying remains a mystery to me, so far. But it's less and less mysterious. After all, if you can identify individual words in the flow of speech, it becomes easier to start identifying other ones, especially since if you know that tsomi is dough, and as she says something, as she puts the dough into what is obviously an oven, she uses some other words referring to the tsomi. Well, you've probably heard either something to do with baking, something to do with putting it in the oven, maybe something to do with how long. You know, it narrows down the possibilities of all this other stuff that's surrounding it. It's got to be something to do with the dough, and we know what she's doing with the dough at that moment, right? That's how this works. And if you also know a thing or two about what different sorts of words look like and sound like, it becomes possible to start to make sense of the rest. For example, I know that adjectives often end in uli and eli, and adverbs tend to end in a. Plus, I've seen a few Georgian verbs, and it seems like they all start with syllables like gamo and chemo and ga'a and ga'i and ga'u. And they end with things like ebs or obs or something with a B in it. Combined with my knowledge of things culinary, and what is clearly displayed on screen, interpretations very gradually start to suggest themselves. I stress very gradually. I'm going to keep coming back to this because it is a very gradual thing. And you just have to have low expectations and then be pleasantly surprised. That's how this whole thing works. There's just no better recipe for discouragement than thinking you're going to understand everything straight off. Your brain needs input, rich, interesting input, and it needs lots of it in order to identify the patterns that lead to comprehension. Now, I can't claim that there's any research backing this bit up, other than my own fairly extensive experience. But it seems to me that this process has certain basic phases when dealing with any source of comprehensible input, whether it's how-to videos like these or something else, say, the firm. They may very well overlap on occasion, and they may not always follow the sequence I'm sketching out here. But as far as I can tell, they will always be present in the process to at least some extent. The first is what I call priming. This is literally anything you do in relation to the content of the video or whatever, or to the language it's in, before you actually engage with the video. This certainly includes any prior knowledge of the language that you may have, as well as any knowledge of other languages, related or otherwise, that help create a framework for you to begin to understand the input that you've chosen. But that's not all. If you know a thing or two, or say everything, about the subject of the how-to video you've selected, that's also priming, because it gives your brain points of reference to start making sense of what the people in the video are trying to tell you. This priming is what leads a lot of people to believe that everyone learns languages differently. The best kind of priming can indeed differ from person to person, as long as it helps provide points of reference. The underlying neuropsychological process, though, remains the same. We acquire language through engagement with some kind of input that offers sufficient points of reference to be comprehensible to us, and that is of sufficient interest to us to hold our attention. And the less stress we're under during the process, the better. In the case of Gurmanya and me, my priming has come in two forms. There's everything I've ever done with Georgian up to now, which has given me some sense of how the language works, and some rudimentary vocabulary. There's also my knowledge of other languages, none of which is at all related to Georgian. Finnish, for example, has helped me make sense out of certain aspects of the Georgian case system. The rest of it comes down to the fact that I'm a very good cook and occasionally decent baker of bread. This gives me an understanding of what Tamtan Bahu are doing on screen that helps my brain decipher what they're saying about it. Language encompasses all human knowledge. It should come as no surprise that all human knowledge can be of assistance in making sense out of language. Sometimes the frame of reference you develop based on all that prior knowledge and your engagement with input can turn out to be wrong in some way. That's okay. It's not even really a bad thing. This is just a thing that happens, and it means you've acquired new knowledge that will help your understanding of the target language become more sophisticated. If what you think ought to mean A turns out to mean something completely different, you've just learned how to say the other thing, whatever that was. That may come in handy one day. Who knows? Now just find out how to say what you actually meant, or what you actually thought you were hearing, and your understanding of how your target language works has just reached a new level. But that's enough about priming. Let's get back to you and your German video on dismantling carburetors. Or was it a Japanese video on making a roux? Next, one of the first things that you will do as you engage with your video, or whatever it is to get used to the way the speaker talks. Everybody has their own idiosyncrasies, their own rhythms, their own style, whether they've developed them consciously or not. Understanding that will help you understand everything else, because you have to learn to distinguish between idiosyncratic things an individual speaker does and things that the language simply does. And that's also why it's useful to watch more than one speaker, but at the same time keep watching them over and over again. That way you start to really kind of learn to distinguish between the ways different people talk and the ways that are similar about how they talk. Gradually, you'll start to get this preliminary sense of where words, phrases, and sentences begin and end. And you'll notice that you keep hearing certain things over and over again. Like, in my case, Solmi and Sapuari and Marili and Aromatizirabuli. That is a good sign. It means your brain is starting to sift through all this input and identify patterns. That's the core of the whole process. Maybe you'll start noticing words that sound familiar, words that might be loan words from another language that you know, so just as I've seen with basiliki, for example, which, I mean, that's obviously basil. Even if they weren't loading a bunch of green leaves that I can immediately identify because I use that stuff all the time into a blender at the time, or whatever it was, I forget. The more of this material you listen to, the more of these repeated and familiar words you're going to notice. You'll start to notice that certain things are said when certain things are happening. For example, I recently noticed that I was always hearing the words nzadari or nzada whenever one of the presenters had just finished something. My sense of it was that they had to mean something like done or finished or ready. I decided to Google what I heard, and after trying multiple spellings, because the thing about Georgian is there are lots of consonants that get clustered together, and some of them you can't necessarily hear very easily. I found it, and it did in fact mean is ready. So that's a thing I know. I would suggest the same approach. First, develop an understanding of what the words you keep hearing might mean, and only then look them up to see how close you are. Don't worry about fossilization of errors. That's actually not a thing. And that's it, really. You expose yourself to more and more input, notice more and more patterns, develop more and more preliminary understandings of what you're hearing or reading or whatever, and then you revise them. And then you go back to the same content or different, maybe related content, and you find fewer and fewer things that are totally new and unknown, at which point you start finding patterns in them, developing understandings, validating or revising them, and going back knowing a little more each time. That's it. That's the process. The rest of it is priming and material selection. Thank you to everyone who's made it this far. I hope it's been worth your while. If it has, please like and subscribe, and if you enjoy this content, please consider paying for it by supporting my Patreon, subscribing to my Twitch, or making a direct contribution. Links are in the description. It helps me keep making more of these things for you. And that's it. I hope you have a good rest of your day.